Individuals stumble into danger. Institutions plan. That difference matters. This episode centers on CERN, the world's most powerful particle collider, and why its work has raised concern among some Christians. What people opened accidentally through games, rituals, and curiosity in the previous episode, others approached deliberately, with funding, authority, committees, and confidence. Not to summon, not to worship, but to probe, to test limits, to push boundaries, to see how far reality can be pressed before it resists. This episode is not about superstition. It's about what happens when power believes itself immune to consequence. Because curiosity backed by authority behaves very differently than curiosity driven by ignorance. Institutions don't feel dangerous at first. They feel careful. They form panels. They publish safeguards. They speak in measured language designed to reassure. Risk is quantified. Consequence is abstracted. No single person feels responsible for what might happen, because responsibility is distributed. That diffusion creates confidence. And confidence, more than ignorance, is what allows boundaries to be tested without fear. Before anything physical ever happened, something subtle shifted: the language. Scientists stopped speaking only about particles and equations and began speaking about events. At CERN, researchers themselves began using language about hidden dimensions, unseen boundaries, and realms beyond direct observation, not as metaphors, as working concepts. Language reveals assumptions long before conclusions are reached, and not everyone was comfortable with the shift. Some researchers began using words like interaction instead of observation. Others spoke about contact rather than collision. A few openly admitted discomfort, then laughed it off as if to reassure themselves. But the words kept slipping through, as if the science itself was gesturing towards something it could not fully name. If you're watching this because something already feels off, you'll want to stay with this series. The machines were designed to answer questions. What is matter? What existed at the beginning? What lies beneath observable reality? But as energy levels increased, the questions changed shape. Experiments intensified. Margins narrowed. Power rose. And quietly, some researchers admitted something unsettling. They expected data, patterns, measurements, predictable outcomes. But at CERN, the scale changed everything. They did not expect response, not malfunctions, not glitches, something behaving as though it was aware of being observed. Response, a sense that the experiment was no longer one-sided, as if the act of probing itself had been noticed. This was not something written into press releases. It surfaced in interviews, in offhand remarks, in pauses before answers. That same word began to appear again. Awareness. At first, anomalies are dismissed. Every system produces noise. Every experiment produces artifacts. But the same irregularities appear again and again, not randomly, not evenly. Patterns emerge that don't align with expectation. Researchers rerun tests, adjust parameters, increase power. The results stabilize, but the unease does not, because the data doesn't behave like error. It behaves like reaction, and reactions imply something on the other side of the interaction. The most troubling part wasn't the first anomaly. It was the repetition. Irregularities appeared across separate tests, under different conditions, with different teams. Each time, the explanation sounded sufficient, until it wasn't. When patterns refused to disappear, people stopped calling them noise. They call them behavior. And behavior implies intention, even when no one is willing to say that word aloud. Scientists are trained to avoid language that implies agency, so when they begin using words like watching, observing back, or responding, it matters. For Christians, that language carries weight, because Scripture has long warned that not all realms are inert or unresponsive. Some said it cautiously, Some joked after saying it. Some refused to clarify at all. But witnesses noticed the tone, the discomfort, the hesitation, because this wasn't fear, it was recognition. The same recognition individuals described in earlier episodes. Not terror, awareness, as if something beyond the experiment was paying attention, as if observation had become interaction. What people are encountering didn't start with them, and it doesn't end here. This is where many people misunderstand the danger. There are no candles, no symbols, no chants, no belief required. At CERN, access is pursued technologically, not spiritually. But access does not require belief to function. That's exactly the problem, because authority has replaced caution. Institutions assume that intelligence controls outcome, that if something exists, it can be measured. If it can be measured, it can be managed. That assumption has failed before. Repeatedly, what individuals open through ignorance, institutions open through confidence, and confidence does not hesitate. But belief has always acted as a brake. It forces caution. It introduces fear. It slows action. But systems built on disbelief feel no such restraint. If nothing answers back, there is no reason to hesitate. That assumption removes the last barrier. And when access is pursued without reverence or fear, it becomes purely technical. What is technical is repeatable, and what is repeatable eventually becomes routine. Long before machines existed, warnings were given, not about technology, but about reaching into places not meant for us. Not because knowledge was necessarily evil, but because access carried consequences. Those warnings were dismissed as myth, until modern language began describing the same risks, without intending to. Barriers, veils, thin places, thresholds, different words, same boundary. What makes CERN different is not intent, but scale, power, and persistence beyond anything the ancient world could achieve. Never before has access been pursued with this level of power, precision, and persistence. When ancient warnings are mentioned, they are not feared. They are smiled at, labeled symbolic, cultural, primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. Modern institutions pride themselves on superiority, better tools, better language, better control. The assumption is simple. If something existed, we would already understand it. That assumption has failed before, often, but arrogance doesn't study history for humility. It studies it to feel justified. Here is the quiet escalation most people miss. Individuals grant access through participation. Institutions grant access through authorization. Budgets, approvals, committees, international cooperation. Permission layered upon permission. At CERN, access is not granted by one person, but by nations, funding bodies, and decades of institutional momentum. Once access is normalized, it stops feeling dangerous. And that's when the most important question disappears. What happens if something comes back? Because institutions don't ask that question. They ask, can we replicate it? Can we stabilize it? Can we continue? Curiosity doesn't retreat once it's funded. Access rarely arrives with ceremony. It arrives through paperwork, approvals, revisions, safety reviews that measure equipment, not consequence. Each step feels smaller than the last. No one feels responsible for the whole. Responsibility diffuses. Momentum builds. What began as exploration becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure does not stop easily, especially when careers, prestige, and funding are aligned toward continuation. By the time doubt surfaces, access has already been normalized. No one signs a form believing it opens anything. Each signature feels small, a line item, a renewal, a procedural step. But authorization compounds. Layers of approval transform exploration into infrastructure. Once infrastructure exists, stopping feels irresponsible. Momentum replaces reflection, and by the time anyone asks whether access should exist at all, the system depends on it continuing. People assume experiments can simply be stopped. They can't. Momentum doesn't reverse quietly. Prestige resists caution. And institutions do not admit uncertainty easily. Even if something unexpected were encountered, the pressure would be to proceed, not pause. Discovery is rewarded. Restraint is not. That is why some Christians are uneasy, because once access is normalized at CERN, it may not be possible to close what has been opened. That imbalance matters, because it means access once gained is rarely surrendered. Here is the most unsettling thought of all. What if the danger was never that humans would find something? What if the danger was that something would finally realize how to be found? The unsettling possibility is not that something unfamiliar was discovered. It's that familiarity was never required. Access alone may have been enough. Once boundaries are tested repeatedly, they weaken, not physically but conceptually, and what was once impossible becomes acceptable. The question is no longer what might come through. The question becomes what has been adapting all along. Individuals open doors without knowing it. Institutions open them believing they're in control. The fear is not that CERN is intentionally summoning dark forces, but that repeated access invites response from a realm Scripture says has always existed, and whatever crossed boundaries long ago understands the difference. The question now isn't whether doors can be opened, it's whether anyone remembers how to close them. In the next episode, we examine what happens when access becomes influence, and whether something unseen has been shaping human behavior far longer than science admits. Demons Among Us continues.
Cheers!